Welcome to Wild Ideas, the podcast by the Wilderness Center, connecting people and nature. This is the podcast from May 5th, 2009.
I'm Gordon Maupin, and with me today is Joanne Ballback, a science educator.
Hi.
And Gary Popotnick, a conservation biologist.
Hi.
And I'm sort of a general naturalist. Well, Joanne, what's going on outside?
Oh, there's so much going on outside. It's spring, Gordon. But I've been especially watching the leaves on the trees. It seemed like last week they were just a tiny little bit of green haze. This week, things are popping out. The oak tree is blooming, and its leaves are coming out. As you look out over the hills, everything looks green. But my favorite are the tamaracks. I like them because they're a deciduous conifer. Seems backwards.
Like bald cypress.
Yeah, like bald cypress. And last week, they were just a little bit of green fuzz. This week, the needles are fully out.
Where are you seeing tamarack at?
There are a couple as I drive on my way to work. There are two nice stands no matter which way I go.
Really, that's a potential wetland area maybe that needs to be looked into.
Okay. Gordon, what did you see this week?
Well, you know what they say, you can take the boy out of the South, but you can't take the South out of the boy.
And your boy we've tried to take out of the South.
You took me physically out of the South, but I don't know if mentally I'll ever get out of the South. So I can't say I saw anything in particular, and I was really trapped in the office this week. And so just before we started this podcast, I did something that you two as Yankees may not really quite comprehend. Uh-huh. I went out on the trail and I moseyed.
Well, that's my normal pace.
Moseying, for those of you who are Yankees and don't really understand this concept, isn't really quite like walking. Walking is what Yankees do to get from one place to another. Mosey is what Southerners do for enjoyment. And I've really just escaped from the office a little bit. And oh my gosh, it is such the height of spring. I saw so many things. I can't even remember everything I saw. And part of it is the mosey pace, because you're not really walking. You're just sort of moving. And if you're doing it by yourself and you're in the woods, this really affords you the opportunity to see all sorts of things. And amazingly, often things come to you instead of you going to the things. So as I got partway down the trail, gorgeous hooded warbler at eye level, not a bird you see all that often, and got a really, really good look. Saw a wren, didn't get to see his head, so I wasn't absolutely certain of the species, maybe a Carolina wren. Many wildflowers. I can't remember all of them. The big white trilliums are in full bloom. Gorgeous flower. And as I was coming back, I heard that maniacal call of the pileated woodpecker, so I just kept moseying sort of in his direction, and pretty soon he came to me, and I got a good look at the pileated woodpecker. So I would encourage everybody to get some time by yourself, get out in the woods, and step out there, but for goodness sakes, don't go for a walk. Mosey. So, Gary, what have you seen this week?
Well, I was walking through the woods.
Can't help it, you're a Yankee.
Although I do know how to mosey, but I had time constraints on me at the moment. Anyway, I was back at our Dowdy Gorge Preserve. Once again, it's a beautiful, beautiful piece of property we own in Holmes County.
Gordon has called that the crown jewel of the Wilderness Center.
It is indeed.
Beautiful, beautiful place.
Deep Gorge, it's geologically, it's what they call a reverse stream. The glaciers, continental glaciers, came down and dammed streams that were flowing north towards Lake Erie, dammed them up and formed glacial lakes. And when the glacial lakes filled up deep enough, they overflowed and the streams reversed, and that's what cut that gorge.
But I like it because that gorge gives me some of the feeling of my northern home on the shaded sides.
That's right. You're from the state up north.
Yep.
Yeah, the steep walls there also really protected that from grazing, which is really what devastates natural habitats often even more than timbering and logging, actually far more than timbering and logging in many cases. And so the species diversity of wildflowers at our Doughty Gorge property is just incredible.
It is, but I bet it wasn't wildflowers you were going to talk about, Gary.
Actually, it isn't or wasn't. And in fact, the reason I was there is we work on our conservation planning, trying to look at populations of invasive plants. And while I was out there, on one of the trails, I came upon a pair of eastern box turtles that were copulating. And the first thing I thought of was Gordon.
Well,
Gordon.
Now, Gary, come on now. I hope you averted your eyes.
But Gordon has been fascinated with the restoration of populations of eastern box turtles. And here at our headquarters, we are actually on the northern range of box turtles.
Eastern box turtle.
Of eastern box turtles, thank you, in Ohio. And Gordon has several ideas on actually reintroducing them to our headquarters preserve here. So with that in mind, Gordon, what do you say we talk a little bit about eastern box turtle today?
Well, we'll talk about eastern box turtles and box turtles in general. Sounds like a plan.
Good. That was interesting, Gary, because I didn't know we had any box turtles at Doughty Gorge. So now I know there's at least 2,
Yes.
maybe a small breeding
Yes,
population.
Certainly, we do have a small. Certainly, we do have a breeding population of some sort there. Since Gordon has been here at TWC and is as old as dirt,
Thanks.
Gordon, what can you tell us about the population? What do you know about the population at Doughty?
I know we have seen box turtles there over the years from time to time, and we have reports from some of the visitors there of box turtles, and it was very encouraging to hear you observing a pair mating. I'm very worried about our population of box turtles there, and it's a sort of a unique thing about box turtle ecology. The box turtles, a male and a female box turtle, the only way they locate each other is visually. And so 2 box turtles stumbling around in the woods, if you can imagine a box turtle stumbling, they don't do that too often since they're sliding their shell, their plastron, that's their bottom shell along, but they actually have to visually locate each other or there will be no mating, and it's a certain time of the year. And if the population density drops too low, then your matings become less and less frequent. They may not find each other every single year, and so then you get a declining spiral of the population. Well, this is a tricky thing for us as humans to comprehend because you may be going there year after year and seeing a box turtle or 2 over a fairly wide area and think things are okay, but these animals will live many, many years. It's not at all unusual to see box turtles. You turn them over on their back and you look at that plastron, and in the younger ones under 30 years old, you can often count growth rings on those scales on the plastron. The really old ones, they've dragged that shell along the ground so long that they've slicked that off, and so you can tell a really old turtle if all the growth rings are sort of slicked off on the bottom of the shell. And so you could have essentially what is remnant disappearing populations and still see box turtles in an area, but if the males and females, if the density has dropped so low the males and females aren't finding each other consistently, then you've got a real concern. And so going to Doughty Gorge, you don't see box turtles every time you're there. You've got to wonder what's going on. Are we getting preciously close? That's why it was so delightful that you observed a mating pair there.
You know, when you look at the structure of the ground layer of plants and the number of natives we have there, it makes a lot of sense that with native plant populations, say with violets, the box turtles can see up and over that vegetation and yet you have Mayapples, and they can see underneath them, and there's you don't get that visual impediment that you might get with non-native species.
That could be a structural factor in their ecology. I think the real thing that people get concerned about is when you had a healthy population in an area, and then you start seeing fewer and fewer individuals.
I wonder if that could be what's happened here at the main tract.
Well, the history of our main tract is Bob Hawes, our naturalist emeritus, when he first came here in 1965, he went around and talked to people about the land here and collected stories. And one of the stories he had was of up off our Pioneer Path trail, where they were grazing the woods in that area, of cattle stepping on box turtles.
There were so many. Huh.
There were enough that, it managed to filter down in the folklore of the land here, that there were box turtles here and that people remembered cattle stepping on them. So there was certainly a population here. And even today, on rare occasions, we will be walking our headquarters track, where we essentially consider the box turtles extirpated. We'll occasionally see one. Mm-hmm. Now, what we don't know is if this is a box turtle someone has picked up somewhere else and released here. We always number them and mark them and release them again. Or if they could somehow be lost, lonely individuals, persisting from an older population.
In case any of our listeners don't know the word, would you back up and explain extirpate?
Extirpate, there's two things that can happen to species. If they go extinct, that means they're gone from the entire planet Earth and will never come back. Mm-hmm. Extirpated is when you have a population that was in an area and people knew it was there, and it vanishes from that particular area. The species is still on the planet Earth somewhere, but in that particular area that you're talking about, it's no longer there. That's what they refer to as extirpation. And so the eastern box turtle, if it's not extirpated from our headquarters tract here, it's right on the very, very thin edge of that.
Mm-hmm.
Forest fragmentation certainly seems to be a problem in the loss of box turtle populations, as well as these parcels of land get smaller and smaller, or the distance between forest lands becomes greater and greater. Populations become isolated, and therefore there are problems genetically when you isolate a smaller population of a particular species.
This is why we as conservation biologists are focused on really two things for preserving species nowadays. One is what we call the size of the island. Now, we all know what an island in the ocean is, surrounded by water. On terrestrial habitats, you can have an island of forest habitat surrounded by farmland or housing developments or something like that, and effectively it is just as much an island as an island surrounded by ocean. And so when you separate blocks of habitat like that, you have a problem. You need to have genetic exchange of individuals between the two. So conservation biologists often focus very hard on connecting islands. And of course, the bigger the island you have, the greater biodiversity you will have on that island. This is actually can be calculated with some mathematical precision. So we look for connections so that populations can move back and forth between blocks of habitat, and we look for the size of the habitat blocks that you can have. If it gets too small, you just won't have enough diversity, enough interaction, enough space to maintain a large enough population size to be sustainable.
Makes sense. It takes a bigger place to support a bear than it does to support a ladybug.
Yes, but even a ladybug has a minimum amount of space that is required to have a sustainable population.
Because you need more than one ladybug on that space.
So now we're back to talking about, as biologists, talking about populations again instead of individuals. So,
and if anybody out there is interested, the earliest work done on this was, I believe, Wilson and MacArthur.
Yes.
And Strong and Simberloff were probably the next generation, And there are tons and tons of great papers as well as some very interesting texts out there on island biogeography.
So it's actually that theory has revolutionized conservation biology. I remember when I'm old enough to admit I knew when it was first coming out. I thought, why are people so interested in this? And I didn't personally have the vision to see all the implications of it. And it's a good thing there were folks that did.
You know, and sometimes out there you'll hear about riparian corridors, and basically that's the same thing a lot of times that we're looking at.
Yeah, it's connectivity.
Yeah, it's connectivity between places that can be inhabited by populations of species.
You'll have people refer to, travel corridors and biodiversity corridors and connectivity corridors and that sort of thing in terms of conservation biology. And that's the reason they're talking about this stuff, and that's why it's important. But getting back to box turtles, I should say to our listeners out there, box turtles are the one reptile everybody loves.
Yes.
They are about as sweet and innocuous a creature as you're ever going to run across. I can't think of a negative thing to say about the box turtle. And little boys and girls can enjoy seeing them and everything else. But I would caution people, if you're out in the woods where there is a population of box turtles, see the box turtle, enjoy it. I don't think there's a problem if you turn one over and count his growth rings and try to get some pleasure out of that. But leave the animal in the woods. It's really actually quite a sad thing when you remove a box turtle, because if you don't release it in the same place, the box turtles become perpetually disoriented. At a very young age, they imprint on a very localized area. And if you release one somewhere else, instead of stopping to make a life there, the creature perpetually searches for the habitat, the home range that it was imprinted upon. It was imprinted upon it when it was a hatchling. And so they just wander. They just travel. And they never accomplish that goals of reproduction that we would like to see to have a population.
And didn't I read somewhere that box turtles can live to be about 100?
They can live to be quite old. I don't know what the record is.
Okay.
But like I say, you can turn them over, and it's not a big deal to find one and count 30 growth rings, and have a 30-year-old turtle.
I'm just imagining that poor young turtle looking for home for 100 years.
Well, that is very much a possibility. Also, with long-lived species, when species live a long time, their reproductive strategy is a little different. And so box turtles will lay a small clutch of eggs, I think about 4, and then it's not a slam dunk that if those 4 hatch, that any of them will make it past the size where they're susceptible to predators, which are often chipmunks, will get the young turtles before their shell has become strong enough to resist that predation. And so a population where you have turtles living to be 100 years old, say, you have a stable population when that turtle replaces itself over that 100-year period. And so it is hardly a slam dunk that any one turtle hatchling will make it to that 30-year mark. And I think it takes 5 or 6 before they're really able to resist chipmunk predation and other creatures.
5 or 6 years.
Yes, and I've even found turtles out in the wild where you see tooth marks. I remember one in particular had to be a coyote tooth puncture actually in the top shell, and the turtle had survived that nicely.
There's also one other problem that we find out there with eastern box turtle populations and a lot of the land turtles, in fact, and that's upper respiratory tract disease, which is easily transmitted from one individual to another and therefore from one population to another. So if you do have a box turtle and that particular turtle has URTD and you release him and he then interacts with turtles from another population, the disease is very easily transmitted.
I know that's very much when we look towards maybe doing some restoration of box turtles to our headquarters tract here. That was certainly an issue. One of the college professors we consulted on this was very well aware of the diseases, and we had to be very careful if we were going to get a project going to restore box turtles here to screen the animals for that disease before trying to release them.
I have a quote about turtles, and this is from one of my favorite writers, Dr. Seuss. He said, "And the turtles, of course. All the turtles are free, as turtles, and maybe all creatures should be."
That is great.
Dr. Seuss is great as a poetry. Anything you want to share with the group, Gary?
Gosh, folks, get outside right now. You'll never see a greater variety of hues of green out there than you will right now. At least that's the case here in the Northeast, in the Great Lakes.
And I would say no matter where you're from, it's a great time to get outside and
Mosey.
I think I'm going to mosey back to the office.
Aw.
Wild Ideas, the podcast, is produced by the Wilderness Center, a nonprofit nature center, land conservancy, and ecopreneurial organization located in northeastern Ohio. Visit the Wilderness Center on the web at wildernesscenter.org.